Blood stained the frost-covered ground crimson, each droplet freezing before it could sink into the earth. The mighty Alpha King Karthus Vandraman, terror of battlefields and sovereign of the Silverhowl Pack, stumbled through the skeletal trees of the border forest, his vision blurring with each labored breath. The ambush had been perfectly orchestrated, a vicious coalition of rival packs striking when his guard was lowest. Now, separated from his warriors, and bleeding from wounds that should have killed any lesser wolf, he pressed one massive hand against the gash in his side, feeling life seep through his fingers like water through stone. The winter wind howled through the branches above, carrying with it the distant sounds of pursuit. His enemies would not stop until they confirmed his death. Karthus gritted his teeth, forcing his legs to carry him deeper into the forgotten regions of the territory, where even his own people rarely ventured. The world tilted dangerously, darkness creeping at the edges of his consciousness. After all the wars he had won, all the challenges he had conquered, was this how the great Alpha King would fall? Alone, in the cold, hunted like prey? His knees buckled, and he collapsed against the trunk of an ancient oak, its bark rough against his back. The moon above seemed to mock him with its pale, indifferent light. He could feel his wolf retreating deep within, too injured to emerge, too weak to heal what had been broken. The taste of copper filled his mouth. Death, it seemed, had finally come to collect its debt. Then, through the haze of approaching unconsciousness, he heard it. Footsteps. Light, hesitant, but approaching nonetheless. Friend or foe, he could no longer tell. His hand moved instinctively to the blade at his hip, but his fingers barely had the strength to grip the hilt. A figure emerged from the shadows between the trees, and what Karthus saw made him question whether he had already crossed into the spirit realm. A young woman, impossibly pale in the moonlight, with hair as white as fresh snow cascading over her shoulders. She wore a dress of deep crimson that seemed to absorb the darkness around her, a stark contrast to her porcelain skin. Her eyes, wide with shock and fear, locked onto his face, and he saw recognition flash across her delicate features. She knew who he was. Of course she did. Everyone in the kingdom knew the face of their king. What surprised him was that she did not run. Althira Sunwatch had not expected to find anyone in these woods, least of all the Alpha King himself. For years she had survived in the forgotten corners of the Pack's territory, scavenging for herbs and roots, sleeping in abandoned shelters, invisible to those who had banished her family when she was barely more than a child. The Sunwatch name had once meant something, before the conspiracy, before the accusations, before everything had been stripped away. Now, she was nothing. A ghost haunting the edges of a kingdom that had rejected her. And yet, here before her, bleeding and broken, was the very symbol of that kingdom. The man whose laws had allowed her family's destruction. The Alpha King who ruled while she starved. Every rational thought screamed at her to leave him, to let fate take its course, to allow the same indifference that had been shown to her family to claim him in turn. Justice, some might call it. Karma. But Althira had never been one to listen to rational thoughts. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already reaching for the wound at his side. His eyes, dark and fierce even in their dimming state, focused on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You should run," he rasped, his voice like gravel and smoke. "Enemies. Coming." "Then we do not have much time," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, tearing strips from the hem of her already tattered dress. She had learned the old ways from her grandmother before the banishment, knowledge of herbs and healing that most modern wolves had forgotten in their reliance on pack healers and medical facilities. Karthus watched her through half-closed eyes, confusion mixing with the pain. She worked quickly, pressing a poultice of crushed herbs against his wound before binding it tightly. Her touch was gentle but sure, and something about it sent warmth through his cold limbs, something beyond mere physical comfort. "Why?" he managed to ask, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 questions. Althira paused, her pale eyes meeting his. In them, he saw old pain, deep as oceans, but also something else. Something that looked almost like compassion. "Because no one deserves to die alone in the cold," she whispered. "Not even a king." She worked through the night, her small frame shielding his larger one from the worst of the wind. When his pursuers drew near, she used knowledge she had never shared with anyone, whispering words in the old tongue and pressing her palms against the earth. The shadows seemed to deepen around them, the forest itself conspiring to hide them from searching eyes. The hunters passed within yards of their hiding spot, never seeing what was right before them.
Karthus drifted in and out of consciousness, but each time he surfaced, she was there, checking his bandages, keeping him warm with her own body heat despite the way she shivered, speaking softly to him, words he could not quite understand but that soothed something wild and afraid deep in his chest. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances.
If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube. Extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. In one moment of clarity, he caught her wrist as she reached to adjust his coverings. Her pulse fluttered beneath his fingers like a captured bird. "Your name," he said. Not a question, but a command, even weakened as he was. She hesitated, fear flickering across her features. Names had power. Names could be used to find someone, to hunt them, to destroy them. But something in his gaze compelled honesty. "Althira," she finally said. "Althira Sunwatch." Sunwatch. The name stirred something in his memory, something important, but the pain dragged him under before he could grasp it. His grip on her wrist loosened, and the last thing he felt before darkness claimed him completely was her cool palm against his fevered forehead, and a strange sense of peace he had not known in years. When he woke again, it was to the sound of familiar voices. His warriors had found him, their relief palpable in the air. Strong hands lifted him, and he was vaguely aware of being carried through the forest. He tried to speak, to tell them about the white-haired woman who had saved him, but his tongue felt thick and useless. As consciousness faded once more, he reached out toward the shadows where he had last seen her, but found only empty air. Althira watched from her hiding place among the trees as the royal guard carried their king away. She pressed herself against the rough bark, making herself small, invisible, as she had learned to do so well over the years. Relief and regret warred in her chest. He would live. That was what mattered. But she knew better than to expect gratitude or recognition. Girls like her, Omega outcasts with banished names, did not get rewarded for their kindness. More likely, she would be punished for daring to touch royalty without permission, for using forbidden knowledge, for existing where she should not have been. So she melted back into the forest, back into the shadows, back into the half-life of survival that had been her existence for so long. She returned to the small, crumbling shelter she called home, deep in a ravine where no one ever came. And she tried to forget the feel of his hand on her wrist, the intensity of his gaze, the strange pull she had felt toward him despite everything he represented. But forgetting, she would learn, was not so simple. Days passed, then weeks. Karthus recovered in the royal castle, his formidable constitution aided by whatever treatment the mysterious Omega had provided. His healers were baffled by how well the wound had closed, how little scarring remained from injuries that should have been fatal. They called it a miracle. Karthus called it something else. He remembered her face with perfect clarity. White hair, red dress, eyes that held both sorrow and strength. Althira Sunwatch. He had his scholars search the records for that name, and what they found made his blood run cold. The Sunwatch family had been banished 12 years ago on charges of conspiracy against the throne. Charges that even at the time had seemed flimsy at best. The family had scattered, most dying in the harsh wilderness beyond pack protection. There had been a daughter, the records noted, but her fate was unknown. "Find her," Karthus ordered his trackers. "The Omega with white hair who saved my life in the border forest. I want her found and brought to the castle." His men searched, but it was as if she had vanished like morning mist. The few loners and outcasts they questioned in the forgotten regions claimed to know nothing of any white-haired woman. Either they were lying, or she was far better at hiding than anyone anticipated. Weeks turned into a month, and still, there was no trace of Althira Sunwatch. Karthus found himself thinking of her at odd moments. During council meetings, his mind would wander to the memory of her gentle hands on his wounds. During training sessions, he would recall the fierce determination in her eyes as she shielded him from his enemies. At night, alone in his chambers, he wondered what kind of woman would show such compassion to someone who represented everything that had destroyed her life. The kingdom needed his attention. There were treaties to negotiate, defenses to rebuild, traitors to root out from the coalition that had ambushed him. And yet, he could not shake the feeling that something vital was missing, that there was a piece of his life's puzzle he had not yet found. It was during an inspection tour of the kingdom's poorest districts that fate, or destiny, or something more ancient intervened once more. The outer settlements were a place of desperation, where those who had fallen from pack favor eked out meager existences on the fringes of society. Karthus walked among them with a small guard, his presence causing ripples of fear and curiosity. He saw the hunger in their eyes, the way they pulled their children close, and something in his chest tightened uncomfortably. This was his kingdom. These were his people. And he had been so consumed with wars and politics that he had not truly seen their suffering. Then, in a narrow alley between two dilapidated buildings, he saw her. Althira knelt in the dirt, her white hair dulled with dust, her red dress now faded and torn. Before her stood 3 small children, thin as wraiths, and she was dividing what looked like a single piece of bread into equal portions, handing each child their share before taking nothing for herself. Her hands trembled with hunger, her face gaunt, but her smile for the children was gentle and warm. Karthus stopped so abruptly that his guards nearly collided with him. His heart, that organ he had thought long since hardened by war and duty, gave a painful lurch in his chest. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, and their eyes met for the second time. Recognition flared immediately, followed by stark terror. The bread fell from her fingers as she scrambled to her feet, swaying slightly from weakness. The children scattered like startled birds. "You," Karthus said, his voice rough with emotions he could not name. Althira dropped to her knees in the dirt, her head bowed, white hair falling forward to hide her face. "Forgive me, Alpha King," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did not mean to offend. I will leave this district immediately. Please, do not punish the children. They have done nothing wrong." His guards moved forward, but Karthus held up a hand, stopping them. He stepped closer to the kneeling Omega, close enough to see the way her entire body shook, though whether from fear or hunger or cold, he could not tell. Probably all 3. "Look at me," he commanded, his tone softer than he intended. Slowly, so slowly, she raised her head. Her pale eyes were wide, resigned to whatever punishment she imagined was coming. There were dark circles beneath them, and he could see the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the thinness of her wrists. How long had she been starving? How long had she been surviving like this on the very edges of existence? "You saved my life," Karthus said, and watched surprise flicker across her features. "I have been searching for you. I did not expect reward, Alpha King. I only did what anyone should do." "But not what anyone would do," he countered. "Especially not someone who had every reason to let me die." She flinched at that, confirming his suspicions. She had known exactly who he was, what he represented, and she had saved him anyway. The knowledge sat heavy in his chest, a debt he could never adequately repay. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand to her. "To the castle." Pure panic crossed her face. "Please, Alpha King. I have committed no crime. I have not trespassed on pack lands. I remain in the outer districts as the banishment specified. I have followed every rule, I swear it." "I know," Karthus said, his hand still extended. "You are not being arrested, Althira Sunwatch. You are being summoned. There is a difference." Her gaze dropped to his offered hand, as if it were a venomous snake. For a long moment, she did not move, clearly torn between obedience to her king and terror of what might await her at the castle. Finally, with visible effort, she placed her trembling hand in his. The contact sent a jolt through Karthus, something electric and startling. Her hand was so small in his, delicate and cold, and he found himself wanting to wrap both of his around it, to transfer some of his warmth into her frozen fingers. Instead, he gently pulled her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "I will not harm you," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "You have my word." She looked up at him, searching his face for deception, and whatever she saw there must have satisfied something in her because she gave a tiny, hesitant nod. The walk to the castle was surreal for Althira. She had not been inside the capital proper since her childhood, before the banishment, when the world had still made sense. Now, walking beside the Alpha King himself, with his elite guards flanking them, she felt like she was moving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The boundary between the two had always been thin in her life. People stopped and stared as they passed. Whispers followed in their wake. Who was this ragged Omega walking beside their king? What crime had she committed? What would her punishment be? Althira kept her eyes on the ground, her hand still clasped in Karthus's larger one. He had not released her, and some part of her was grateful. If he let go, she might collapse, or run, or simply cease to exist like smoke on the wind. The castle rose before them, all stone and strength, a monument to power and permanence. Everything she was not. She had spent years hating this place from afar, blaming it for her family's destruction. And now she was walking through its gates, being led directly into the heart of everything that had once been her nightmare. They passed through corridors that smelled of beeswax and pine, so different from the rot and desperation of the outer districts. Servants and nobles alike stopped to stare, their shock evident. The Alpha King did not typically bring starving Omegas into his home. Finally, they reached a chamber that appeared to be some kind of sitting room, elegantly furnished but not ostentatious. Karthus released her hand, and she immediately felt the loss of his warmth. She stood in the center of the room, unsure what to do with her hands, acutely aware of how filthy and ragged she must appear in such refined surroundings. "Sit," Karthus said, gesturing to a chair by the fireplace. "I would soil the furniture, Alpha King," she said softly, keeping her gaze lowered. "I am not clean enough for such things." Something that might have been pain crossed his features. "Then we will get you clean. But first, you will sit and you will eat." As if summoned by his words, servants appeared with trays of food. Bread, still warm from the ovens, meat, roasted and glistening. Fruits and cheeses, and things Althira had not tasted in so long, she had almost forgotten their flavors existed. Her stomach clenched painfully at the sight, and she had to press a hand against it to quell the sudden, desperate hunger. "I do not understand, Alpha King," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why am I here?" Karthus settled into the chair across from her, his dark eyes never leaving her face. In the firelight, he looked different than he had in the forest. No less fierce, but more human somehow. She could see the places where silver had begun to thread through his black hair, the scars that marked his hands, the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. "Because you saved my life," he said simply. And because I have come to realize that the kingdom I rule has failed you in every possible way. I cannot undo the past. I cannot bring back what was taken from your family. But I can offer you something now. A position in the royal household, as a servant if you wish. Or something else, if you have other skills. You will have food, shelter, safety. You will never go hungry again. Althea stared at him, certain she had misheard. You wish to employ me? A banished Omega? I wish to repay the debt I owe you, Karthus corrected. And perhaps, in some small way, begin to correct the injustice that was done to your family. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had not cried in years, had trained herself not to, because tears were a luxury she could not afford. They showed weakness, vulnerability, and in her world, such things got you killed. I do not deserve such kindness, she said, the words barely audible. You deserve far more than I am offering, Karthus replied, his voice carrying a roughness that spoke of his own suppressed emotions. But it is a start. Will you accept? What choice did she have? Return to the outer districts, to starvation and cold, and the constant threat of violence? Continue caring for abandoned children with resources she did not possess? At least here, in the castle, she could survive. More than survive, perhaps. She could live. Yes, Alpha King, she said, bowing her head in acceptance. I will serve you with loyalty and gratitude. Karthus, he said, surprising her. When we are alone, you may call me Karthus. She dared to look up at him then, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. There was intensity there, yes, but also something softer. Something that looked almost like care. Karthus, she repeated, testing his name on her tongue. It felt dangerous and intimate all at once. He smiled then, a small quirk of his lips that transformed his entire face. Good. Now eat, Althea. Please, before I am forced to make it a royal command. The food was better than anything she remembered. Each bite felt like a small miracle, and she had to force herself to eat slowly, knowing that her shrunken stomach would rebel if she consumed too quickly. Karthus watched her the entire time, his expression unreadable, and she found herself hyper-aware of his presence, the way he filled the space around him, the quiet strength that radiated from him even in stillness. When she finally could eat no more, servants appeared again to guide her to bathing chambers. The hot water was a revelation, washing away months of accumulated grime and exhaustion. They provided her with clean clothing, simple servant's garb and soft gray fabric that felt like silk against her skin. When she looked at herself in the mirror afterward, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Clean, fed, no longer on the verge of collapse. It was like looking at a ghost of who she might have been in another life. She was given quarters in the servants' wing, a small room but her own, with a real bed and blankets, and a window that looked out over the gardens. That first night, lying in actual comfort for the first time in years, Althea could not sleep. Her mind kept circling back to the Alpha King, to Karthus, to the impossible gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her, so at odds with the fearsome reputation that preceded him. She told herself not to read too much into it. He was repaying a debt, nothing more. She was a servant now, and he was her king. There was a natural order to such things, boundaries that should not be crossed, and yet she could not forget the way his hand had felt around hers, warm and solid and safe. In his own chambers across the castle, Karthus stood by his window, looking out at the moonlit grounds. He should have felt satisfied. He had found the woman who saved him, offered her protection and employment, begun to right an old wrong. And yet, he felt more unsettled than ever. There was something about Althea that called to him on a level he did not fully understand. When he had taken her hand in the outer district, it had felt right in a way that defied explanation, like finding a piece of himself he had not known was missing. He told himself it was simply gratitude, respect for her courage and compassion. But he knew, with the brutal honesty that had made him a successful king, that it was more than that. Much more. And that terrified him in ways that no battlefield ever had. The days that followed established a new rhythm in the castle. Althira took to her duties with quiet efficiency, working in the kitchens and gardens, always present but never intrusive. The other servants were wary of her at first, this strange white-haired Omega who had appeared out of nowhere with the king's favor. But her genuine kindness and tireless work ethic slowly won them over. Strange things began to happen wherever Althira went. The kitchen garden, which had struggled through a blight, suddenly began to flourish. Injured guards who she tended to healed with unusual speed. The hunting hounds, notoriously aggressive with strangers, would calm in her presence, nuzzling against her hands as if she were pack. And the old protective runes carved into the castle's foundations, inactive for generations, began to glow faintly whenever she passed near them. No one noticed at first, or if they did, they dismissed it as tricks of the light. Coincidence, nothing more. But Karthus noticed. He noticed everything about Althira. The way she moved through the castle like a gentle breeze, bringing calm wherever she went. The way she never took more food than she needed, as if still unable to believe in abundance. The way she flinched whenever someone raised their voice, old traumas written into her reflexes. He found himself seeking her out, inventing reasons to be where she was, inspecting the gardens when she was weeding, visiting the kitchens when she was preparing herbs, checking on injured soldiers when she was changing bandages. Each time he told himself it was simple oversight, the duty of a thorough king. But the truth was harder to ignore with each passing day. He was drawn to her. Powerfully, undeniably drawn to her in ways that went beyond gratitude or obligation. And it frightened him, because he knew the complications such feelings could bring. She was a servant in his household, an Omega from a banished family, and he was the Alpha King with responsibilities to his pack and kingdom that transcended personal desire. Any relationship between them would be scrutinized, criticized, potentially used against them both by those who sought advantage. Yet, he could not seem to stop himself from wanting to be near her. Althira, for her part, was equally confused by her own feelings. Gratitude, yes. She was grateful beyond words for the safety and security Karthus had provided. But it was more than gratitude that made her heart race when she heard his footsteps approaching. More than simple respect that made her seek glimpses of him during the day. She tried to maintain appropriate distance, to remember her place. But it was difficult when he would appear in the gardens and speak with her about the herbs she was cultivating, genuinely interested in the old knowledge her grandmother had taught her. It was difficult when he would sit with injured soldiers and ask for her opinion on their treatment, valuing her insight as if she were a trained healer rather than a former outcast. It was difficult when his eyes would find hers across a crowded room and something electric would pass between them, unspoken but undeniable. She told herself it was foolish to feel anything for him. He was the Alpha King, and she was nobody. A servant, a charity case, a woman whose very family name had been erased from honor. What could she possibly offer someone like him? But her heart, it seemed, did not listen to logic. One evening, about 6 weeks after her arrival at the castle, Althira was in the healing wing, preparing poultices for soldiers injured in a border skirmish. She worked alone, preferring the quiet of late hours when most others had retired. The familiar rhythm of grinding herbs and mixing compounds soothed her, connecting her to memories of her grandmother, to a time before loss had defined her existence. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear him enter until he spoke. "You should not work so late," Karthus said from the doorway. "You need rest as well." Althira turned, her heart leaping at the sight of him. He had removed his formal armor and wore simple training clothes, his long black hair loose around his shoulders. He looked younger like this, less like the fearsome Alpha King and more like simply a man. A devastatingly handsome man who made her pulse quicken in ways she knew were dangerous. "I find sleep difficult sometimes, Alpha King," she said softly, turning back to her work to hide the flush she could feel rising in her cheeks. The work helps quiet my mind. Carthus, he corrected, moving into the room. I thought we agreed on that. It feels presumptuous when others might hear. There is no one else here. He came to stand beside her workbench, watching her hands as she ground dried lavender with practiced ease. What troubles your mind so much that sleep eludes you? How could she answer that honestly? That she thought of him constantly? That she replayed every conversation they had shared, analyzing each word, each glance? That she lay awake wondering what it would be like if she were not a servant and he were not a king, if they were simply two souls who had found each other? Old memories, she said instead, which was also true. They are difficult to silence. Carthus was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes studying her profile. I have read the records of your family's case, he said finally. The charges were baseless, built on the testimony of wolves who have since been exposed as traitors themselves. Your family was innocent. Althira's hands stilled in their work. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by the king himself was different. Validation and rage warred in her chest. Does it matter now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They are gone, dead or scattered. Knowing they were innocent does not bring them back. No, Carthus agreed, his voice rough. But it matters for the future. I intend to officially clear the Sunwatch name, to restore what honor can be restored. She looked up at him then, tears threatening despite her best efforts. Why? She asked. Why do you care so much about the wrongs done to one insignificant family? He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement so she could pull away if she wished, and brushed a strand of white hair back from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek for just a moment, warm and gentle. Because you are not insignificant, Althira, he said, his voice low and intense. And because I have been a king too focused on external threats while allowing injustice to flourish in my own home. That ends now. The touch, brief as it was, sent electricity through her entire body. She found herself leaning infinitesimally toward him, drawn by a force she did not understand but could not resist. His eyes darkened, and she saw her own desire reflected there, along with something deeper, something that looked like recognition. For a long moment they stood frozen, the air between them charged with possibility. One of them needed only to move, to close the small distance that separated them, and everything would change. But Carthus stepped back, breaking the spell. Professional distance reasserted itself like a physical barrier. Forgive me, he said, his voice rougher than usual. That was inappropriate. Althira felt the loss of his proximity like a wound. You are the king, she said quietly. Nothing you do requires my forgiveness. That is where you are wrong, Carthus replied, his eyes finding hers again. Everything I do requires the forgiveness of those affected by it, especially you. He left then, his departure swift and final, leaving Althira alone with her racing heart and trembling hands. She pressed her palm to her cheek where his fingers had been, still feeling the ghost of his touch, and knew with absolute certainty that she was falling in love with him. It was the worst possible thing that could happen. And yet, she could not seem to stop. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of attraction and restraint. Carthus maintained professional distance, but his eyes betrayed him at every turn. Althira remained deferential and proper, but found herself inventing reasons to be in his path. They orbited each other like twin stars, drawn by gravity, but unable to collide. The castle staff began to notice. Whispers circulated about the white-haired Omega who had captured the Alpha King's attention. Some were kind, romantic even, spinning stories of fated mates and destined love. Others were cruel, suggesting manipulation and ambition, painting Althira as a scheming outsider using her rescue of the king for personal gain. Althira heard the whispers but said nothing. What could she say? That she harbored feelings for the king but would never act on them? That she knew her place and would never overstep? It would only fuel more gossip, more speculation, so she endured in silence, as she had learned to endure so many things. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. It began with small things. The protective runes around the castle, dormant for generations, started glowing more frequently and more brightly. Ancient wards that had been placed by the first Luna of the Silver Howl Pack centuries ago flickered to life whenever Althira passed. The pack's elders noticed, their eyes narrowing with suspicion and speculation, but they said nothing. Not yet. Then came the night when everything changed. A darkness had been growing in the foundations of the castle, a spiritual rot that the elders had been quietly trying to address for months. It was an ancient curse, they believed, placed by enemies long dead but still potent. Warriors had been losing control of their transformations, shifting at inappropriate times, their wolves becoming aggressive and unpredictable. The castle's mystical defenses, which had protected the pack for centuries, were weakening. The elders had tried everything. Rituals, sacrifices, prayers to the moon goddess. Nothing worked. The darkness continued to spread, and with it, chaos. On the night it reached its peak, Althira was asleep in her small room when screams woke her. She bolted upright, her heart pounding, as the sounds of fighting echoed through the castle. Running to her window, she saw guards transforming uncontrollably, attacking each other in the courtyard below. The very stones of the castle seemed to writhe with shadow, and the air tasted of sulfur and decay. She grabbed her cloak and ran into the corridors, following her instincts toward the center of the disturbance. Other servants fled past her, but she pushed against the tide, drawn by a pull she did not understand. The protective runes on the walls blazed as she passed, brighter than they had ever been, casting silver light that pushed back the shadows. She found herself running toward the ancestral hall, the oldest part of the castle where the first alphas had ruled and where the most sacred rituals still took place. The doors stood open, hanging from broken hinges, and from within came a sound that made her blood run cold. Karthus's voice, raised in a roar of pain and defiance. Althira did not think, she simply ran. The ancestral hall was chaos incarnate. Karthus stood in the center, his form flickering between man and wolf, fighting against something that had no physical shape but was nonetheless terrifyingly real. A spiritual entity, ancient and malevolent, had wrapped itself around him like chains of shadow, trying to consume him from the inside out. His guards lay unconscious around the edges of the room, victims of the entity's power. The king fought alone, and he was losing. No! The word tore from Althira's throat as she watched Karthus fall to one knee, the shadows tightening around his neck. She could see him struggling, could see his strength failing, and something inside her simply broke. Power she had never fully understood, had always kept hidden even from herself, erupted from her like a dam breaking. Silver light, bright as the full moon, radiated from her body in waves. The ancient runes carved into every surface of the hall blazed to life, responding to her energy as if they had been waiting centuries for this moment. The shadows recoiled from the light, shrieking in voices that hurt to hear. Althira walked forward, her feet not quite touching the ground, her eyes blazing with lunar fire. The red of her dress seemed to burn against the silver glow surrounding her. She raised her hands, and the words that came from her mouth were not her own. Or perhaps they were more her than anything she had ever spoken. The old tongue, the first language of wolves, sacred and powerful. The entity turned its attention to her, sensing a threat. It lunged, trying to consume her as it had been consuming Karthus, but the light burned it, dissolved it, tore it apart at its very essence. The shadows screamed and writhed and finally, with a sound like breaking glass, shattered into nothing. The hall fell silent. Althira stood in the center of the floor, breathing hard, the silver light slowly fading from her skin. Around her, the protective runes pulsed once, twice, and then settled into a gentle, steady glow that they had not held in living memory. The castle's defenses, which had been failing for months, were suddenly stronger than they had been in generations. Karthus stared at her, his chest heaving, blood dripping from where the entity's touch had marked him. "Althira," he said, her name a prayer and a question all at once. She looked down at her hands, still faintly glowing, and the truth she had been running from her entire life crystallized with painful clarity. She was not just an Omega. She had never been just an Omega. The elders burst into the hall, having felt the massive surge of spiritual energy from wherever they had been attempting their own futile rituals. They stopped dead at the sight before them. The ancestral hall, clean of corruption for the first time in months. The protective runes, active and strong. And standing in the center, still radiating faint traces of lunar power. A white-haired woman in a red dress. The oldest of the elders, a woman named Thera who had served 3 Alpha Kings, fell to her knees. "The Luna," she breathed, her voice filled with awe and terror. "The hidden Luna has awakened." Althira shook her head, confused and overwhelmed. "I do not understand. I cannot be..." But Thera was already pulling out ancient texts, her hands shaking as she flipped through pages. "The prophecy," she muttered. "The bloodline. We thought they were all dead. We thought the conspiracy had succeeded." She looked up at Althira with tears streaming down her weathered face. "Child, do you know what you are?" "I am nothing," Althira whispered. "An Omega. A banished wolf's daughter." "No," Karthus said, rising to his feet and moving toward her. His voice carried absolute certainty. "You are so much more than that." Thera found the page she sought and held it up with trembling hands. Centuries ago, the moon goddess blessed certain bloodlines with spiritual power, creating Lunas who could protect the pack not just politically, but mystically. They could strengthen wards, heal the land, maintain balance between the physical and spiritual realms. But such power made them targets. A conspiracy arose. Fearful wolves who saw the Lunas as threats to their own power. They hunted these bloodlines, killed them, scattered them, destroyed the records. "The Sunwatch family," another elder breathed. "They were not just falsely accused of conspiracy. They were survivors of the Luna bloodline, and the charges against them were designed to eliminate them before anyone realized what they were." The room spun around Althira, her grandmother's strange teachings, the way animals had always responded to her, the power she had always felt but never understood. Her family had not been banished for crimes they did not commit. They had been targeted for what they were. "But there is more," Thera continued, her eyes moving between Althira and Karthus. "Each Luna was destined for a specific alpha. The moon goddess herself ordained the pairings, bonds that would strengthen both individuals and ensure the pack's prosperity. The ritual to identify these bonds has not been performed in generations, because we believed all the Lunas were dead." Karthus had gone very still. "Are you saying..." "I am saying, Alpha King, that this woman is not just a Luna. She is your Luna, your destined mate, the bond that should have been recognized from birth, but was hidden to protect her from those who would kill her for what she is." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of fate. Althira looked at Karthus, and he looked back at her, and everything suddenly made terrible, beautiful sense. The pull they had felt toward each other from the very beginning, the way her touch had healed him when he was dying, the peace he felt in her presence, the strength she drew from his. Not coincidence, not simple attraction. Destiny. "No," Althira said, stepping back. "This cannot be. I cannot be what you need. I am broken, damaged. I have spent years starving and hiding and barely surviving. How can I be anyone's Luna, let alone his?" The pain in her voice cut through Karthus like a blade. In 2 strides, he crossed the distance between them and took her face gently between his large hands, tilting her head up so she had to meet his eyes. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said fiercely. "You have survived what would have destroyed others. You showed compassion when you had every reason to be cruel. You protected me, even when I represented everything that had hurt you. If you are my Luna, then I am the most fortunate alpha who has ever lived. You do not have to say that, she whispered, tears finally spilling over. I know it is duty, destiny. You do not have to pretend it is more. Pretend? Karthus gave a harsh laugh. Althira, I have been half in love with you since the moment you knelt in the dirt to save a dying stranger. Finding out you are my fated mate does not create my feelings. It only explains them. She stared up at him, searching his face for any hint of deception or obligation, and finding only raw, honest emotion. You cannot mean that. I mean every word, he said, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. And I need you to understand something. This bond, this destiny the elders speak of, it does not obligate you to anything. You are free to reject it, to reject me, if that is your choice. Your life is your own. Your decisions are your own. I will not force you into a role you do not want, fated mate or not. Around them, the elders shifted uncomfortably. Such declarations were unheard of. Fated mates were considered absolute, bonds that must be honored regardless of personal feelings. But Karthus had never been a traditional king, and he would not start now. Not with something this important. Not with her. What if I am not strong enough? Althira asked, her voice small and afraid. What if I fail you? Fail the pack? Then we will face that failure together, Karthus said simply. But, Althira, you have already proven your strength. You destroyed a curse that the most powerful elders in the kingdom could not touch. You awakened defenses that have been dormant for generations. You are exactly what this pack needs. What I need. I am afraid, she admitted, the words barely a whisper. So am I, Karthus replied, and the honesty in his admission made something in her chest ease. He was not pretending this was simple or easy. He was acknowledging the fear, the complexity, the weight of what they were facing. But perhaps we can be afraid together. Althira looked around at the elders, at the restored runes, at the proof of what she was written into the very stones of the castle. Then she looked back at Karthus, at this fierce, powerful man who was looking at her like she was precious beyond measure, and she made her choice. Together, she agreed softly. The smile that transformed Karthus's face was like sunrise breaking over mountains. He pulled her against his chest, and she went willingly, wrapping her arms around him and finally allowing herself to feel safe. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, and his arms around her felt like coming home. We have much to discuss, Elder Thera said, clearing her throat. The proper ceremonies must be performed. The pack must be informed. There are protocols, rituals, preparations. Later, Karthus said, not releasing Althira. For now, let us simply be grateful that the curse is broken and the Luna has been found. The elders exchanged glances, but, wisely, chose not to argue with their Alpha King. They filed out of the ancestral hall, leaving Karthus and Althira alone among the glowing runes and settling dust. What happens now? Althira asked, pulling back just enough to look up at him. Now, Karthus said, brushing a strand of white hair back from her face with infinite gentleness. We take things one step at a time. There is no rush. We have time to know each other properly, to let this bond develop naturally. I want to court you, Althira, not because destiny demands it, but because I genuinely wish to know every part of you. Court me. She could not help the small, surprised laugh that escaped. I am still a servant in your household. Not anymore, Karthus said firmly. From this moment, you are under my personal protection as the recognized Luna. You will have chambers appropriate to your station, guards, attendants, everything you need. The Sunwatch name will be officially restored. Your family will be honored, as they should have been from the beginning. It was too much. Too fast. Just hours ago, she had been a nobody, a servant grateful for scraps. Now she was supposedly a Luna, destined mate of the Alpha King, with power she barely understood. The whiplash was dizzying. Karthus must have seen the panic rising in her eyes because he cupped her face again, grounding her with his touch. "Breathe," he said softly. "Just breathe. We will face each challenge as it comes, but you are not alone anymore. You will never be alone again." And somehow, with him looking at her like that, she could believe it. The days that followed were a maelstrom of change. News of the Luna's awakening spread through the pack like wildfire, generating reactions that ranged from joy to suspicion to outright hostility. Those who had benefited from the old conspiracy, whose families had helped destroy the Luna bloodlines, saw Althira's emergence as a threat to their power and position, but Karthus was unmoved by their protests. He formally cleared the Sunwatch name in a public ceremony, declaring the original charges false and honoring those who had been unjustly killed or banished. He assigned Althira chambers in the royal wing of the castle, next to his own, and made it clear that any disrespect shown to her would be considered disrespect to him. For Althira, the adjustment was profound and disorienting. She went from sleeping on a narrow servant's cot to a bed large enough for 3, from eating kitchen scraps to dining at the royal table, from being invisible to being watched constantly. It was overwhelming, and more than once she found herself retreating to the gardens simply to breathe. Karthus understood, giving her space when she needed it, but always making sure she knew he was there if she wanted company. Their courtship unfolded in quiet moments, stolen between royal duties and Luna training. Walks through the moonlit gardens where he told her about his childhood, and she shared fragmented memories of hers. Shared meals where they talked about everything and nothing. Evenings in the library where he would read to her, or she would teach him about herbs and healing. He was different than she had expected, this fearsome Alpha King. Yes, he was fierce in council meetings, commanding on the battlefield, ruthless with enemies and traitors. But with her, he was gentle, patient. He listened when she spoke as if her words were precious. He asked her opinion on pack matters and actually considered her perspective. He made her feel valued not for what destiny said she was, but for who she had proven herself to be. And slowly, carefully, Althira began to heal. The constant fear that had defined her existence for so long started to ease. She began to sleep through the night. Her hands stopped shaking when she ate. The shadows under her eyes faded. She was transforming, not just into a Luna, but into the woman she might have been if trauma had not shaped her so young. But the world, as it so often does, had other plans. The conspiracy that had destroyed the Luna bloodlines was not as dead as everyone had believed. When word spread that a Luna had survived and been recognized, old fears and old hatreds stirred. Secret meetings were held in dark corners. Alliances were formed between those who had benefited from the Luna's absence and those who feared their return. Plans were made. Karthus's intelligence network caught whispers of the plotting, but the conspirators were careful, covering their tracks well. He increased security around Althira, assigning his best warriors to guard her, but he could not protect her from everything. Not without locking her away, and that he refused to do. She was not a prisoner. She was his Luna, his mate, and she deserved to live freely. The attack came on a night when Karthus was away from the castle, called to address a border dispute that required the Alpha King's personal intervention. In hindsight, it was clear the dispute had been manufactured specifically to remove him from Althira's side, but in the moment, he had no choice but to respond. He left her under heavy guard, making his best warriors swear they would protect her with their lives. It was not enough. The rebel faction struck with precision and planning, using inside knowledge to disable the castle's defenses and corrupt several guards through threats against their families. They breached Althira's chambers in the dead of night, overwhelming her guards before alarms could be raised. She woke to hands grabbing her, to fabric being forced over her face, to the world going dark as drugged cloth stole her consciousness. When Karthus returned to the castle at dawn and learned what had happened, his roar of rage and anguish echoed through every stone corridor. Warriors who had served him for years flinched away from the fury in his eyes, the way his wolf rose so close to the surface that his form flickered between man and beast. Find her, he commanded, his voice barely human. Mobilize every warrior, every tracker, every resource we have. I want her found, now. The pack moved with unprecedented speed and coordination. Trackers followed Althira's scent to the border regions where it mixed with others, indicating she had been transferred between groups to make tracking harder. Scouts reported sightings of suspicious movements heading toward the contested territories where rival packs held sway. Intelligence suggested the rebels planned to use Althira as a bargaining chip, threatening to kill her unless Karthus abdicated or acceded to their political demands. They had underestimated two things: the depth of Karthus's love for his Luna, and the fact that Althira was far more than a helpless hostage. Althira woke in darkness, her head pounding from whatever drug they had used. Her hands were bound behind her, and she was being carried in some kind of covered wagon that jolted over rough terrain. Voices spoke around her in low tones, discussing routes and timelines and ransom demands. Fear threatened to overwhelm her, old terrors from years of running and hiding rising up to choke her. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. The power she had awakened in the ancestral hall had not been a one-time event. It was part of her, as fundamental as breathing, and it responded to her desperation now. The ropes binding her wrists began to smoke and char as silver light seeped from her skin. The men carrying her did not notice, too focused on their conversation. Althira closed her eyes and reached inward, toward that well of lunar energy, and pulled. The wagon exploded with light. Men screamed and fell back, shielding their eyes from the brilliance. Althira rose, the burned remnants of her bonds falling away, her white hair floating around her, as if moved by an otherworldly wind. The power was easier to control this time, responding to her will rather than overwhelming her. "You made a mistake," she said, her voice resonating with authority she had never known she possessed. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." The rebels scrambled for weapons, but she was faster. With a gesture, vines from the forest floor erupted upward, wrapping around their legs, immobilizing them. Another gesture sent their weapons flying from their hands. She had not known she could do these things, but the knowledge seemed to come from somewhere ancient and instinctive, passed down through the bloodline that had made her what she was. She could have killed them. Part of her wanted to, the part that remembered starvation and fear and injustice. But she was not a killer, had never been despite everything she had endured. So instead, she left them bound and began walking back toward the castle, following the bond she could feel pulling her toward Karthus like a compass needle pointing home. She had not gone far when she encountered his forces coming the other way. The warriors stopped dead at the sight of her, walking calmly through the forest, while behind her, the rebels hung suspended in cocoons of vines, thoroughly restrained. The sheer audacity of the image, this small white-haired woman who had somehow single-handedly defeated her captors, left them momentarily speechless. Then Karthus broke through the ranks, and the careful control he had been maintaining shattered. He crossed the distance between them in seconds, pulling Althira into his arms with such force that he lifted her off her feet. His entire body was shaking, and she realized with shock that he was on the verge of tears. "I thought I had lost you," he said into her hair, his voice broken. "When they told me you were taken, I thought I had lost you." Althira wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him just as tightly. "I am here," she said softly. "I am safe. They cannot keep me from you." "Nothing can." He pulled back just enough to look at her, and the raw emotion in his eyes stole her breath. Love, fierce and consuming and absolute. Not because destiny demanded it, but because he had chosen it, claimed it, made it his truth. "I love you," he said, the words urgent and necessary. "I should have said it before. I love you, Althira, not because you are my Luna, though you are, not because you have power, though you do, but because you are you, brave and kind and stronger than anyone I have ever known. I love you. And if anything had happened to you, I would have torn the world apart." Tears streamed down her face, But they were not tears of pain or fear. They were tears of overwhelming relief, of finally allowing herself to believe in something good. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have loved you since you offered me your hand in the outer district, since you looked at me like I was worth something. I love you, Karthus." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like either of them had imagined. It was not gentle or tentative. It was fierce and claiming and full of all the fear they had just endured, all the love they had been holding back. She kissed him back with equal intensity, her fingers threading through his long black hair, holding him to her as if she could merge them into one being through will alone. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the warriors around them were politely looking anywhere else, though more than one wore a small smile. The return to the castle was triumphant. Althira rode with Karthus, held securely against his chest on his horse, and she could feel the way his heart still raced, the way he held her just a little too tightly, as if afraid she might vanish. The rebels were brought back as well, their fate to be decided by the Alpha King, but that was for later. For now, there was only relief, joy, and the bone-deep knowledge that they had found each other against all odds and would not be separated again. The trial of the conspirators was swift and thorough. Evidence was presented, witnesses testified, and the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. It went deeper than anyone had suspected, with roots spreading through several noble families and even some of the pack's elders. Those found guilty were stripped of titles and lands, banished or imprisoned depending on the severity of their crimes. But more importantly, the trial served as a public declaration that the age of hiding Lunas, of suppressing their power, was over. Karthus used the proceedings to announce sweeping reforms, ensuring that spiritual bloodlines would be protected and honored, rather than feared and destroyed. Throughout it all, Althira stood at his side, a visible symbol of what the pack had lost and what they were reclaiming. She spoke at the trial, her voice steady and clear, describing what the conspiracy had cost her family, what it had cost the pack, what it had cost the kingdom. There was not a dry eye in the court when she finished. In the weeks that followed, as the kingdom settled into a new normal, Karthus and Althira's bond deepened. The mate bond, now fully acknowledged and no longer suppressed, sang between them like a living thing. They could sense each other's emotions, feel each other's presence across distances. When Althira had nightmares of her captivity, Karthus was there instantly, holding her until the fear passed. When Karthus struggled with the weight of his responsibilities, Althira's calm presence grounded him, reminded him of why he fought so hard. They spent their evenings planning together, not just their own future, but the kingdom's. Althira proved to have a sharp mind for strategy and a deep compassion for the common wolves that had been neglected for too long. Together, they began implementing changes that would strengthen the pack from the ground up, ensuring that what had happened to the Sunwatch family could never happen again. One evening, about 3 months after Althira's rescue, they stood together on the balcony of the royal chambers, looking out over the castle grounds bathed in moonlight. Althira wore a gown of deepest blue, the color of the night sky, and silver jewelry that gleamed against her pale skin. She was no longer the starving Omega in a ragged red dress. She was a Luna, powerful and confident, though still gentle at her core. Karthus stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. They fit together perfectly, like pieces of a puzzle finding their match. "Do you ever regret it?" Karthus asked quietly. "The way your life changed? You went from being invisible to being watched constantly, from having no responsibilities to carrying the weight of the entire pack's spiritual well-being." Althira leaned back against his solid warmth, considering the question seriously. "Sometimes the attention is overwhelming," she admitted. "And sometimes I miss the simplicity of just tending a garden without everyone analyzing the political implications. But regret?" She turned in his arms to face him, her pale eyes meeting his dark ones. "Never. You gave me back my life, Karthus. You gave me a purpose, a future, a home. How could I ever regret that? I did not give you anything you did not earn yourself. Karthus said, cupping her face with one large hand. You saved yourself from those rebels. You proved your strength over and over. All I did was recognize what was already there. You saw me when I was invisible, Althira corrected. You valued me when everyone else thought I was worthless. That is a gift beyond measure. Karthus smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Then we have given each other gifts, because you taught me to see my kingdom through new eyes, to care about those I had overlooked, to be a better Alpha. You made me better, Althira. She rose on her toes and kissed him softly. We made each other better, she said against his lips. As if in response to their words, the moon above seemed to glow brighter, and the protective runes around the castle pulsed with warm silver light. The land itself seemed to approve of their bond, to celebrate the return of Aluna to her rightful place. The elders are pressing for a formal mating ceremony, Karthus said, his tone suggesting he was bringing up something he knew might be sensitive. They want it done before the full moon next month. Althira tensed slightly in his arms. And what do you want? I want whatever makes you comfortable, Karthus said immediately. If you need more time, we take more time. The elders can wait. The pack can wait. I will wait as long as you need. She pulled back to study his face, seeing nothing but sincerity there. This man, this Alpha King who commanded armies and ruled a kingdom, was willing to wait for her, to let her set the pace. The knowledge settled something anxious in her chest. I do not need more time, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I am ready, Karthus, ready to stand beside you, not just as your Luna, but as your mate, your partner, your equal. Ready to commit to this life, this future, this love we have built. The joy that lit his face was brighter than any moon. Are you certain? I will not rush you, Althira. There is no deadline except the ones others try to impose. I am certain, she said firmly. I spent too many years surviving instead of living. I am done merely surviving. I want to live, fully and completely, and I want to do that with you. Karthus lifted her off her feet, spinning her around while she laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. When he set her down, he immediately dropped to one knee before her, taking her hand in both of his. Then let me do this properly, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Althira Sunwatch, Luna of my heart and soul, will you consent to be my mate? Will you stand beside me as we build a better kingdom? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you the love and respect you deserve? Althira felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but these were happy tears, tears of overwhelming joy and rightness. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes to all of it. Today, tomorrow, forever, yes. He rose and kissed her deeply, and the moon above blazed with silver fire. All across the kingdom, wolves looked up at the sky and felt it, the confirmation of a bond that had been written in the stars since before either Karthus or Althira had been born. Their Luna had found her Alpha. The pack was complete. The month leading up to the mating ceremony was a whirlwind of preparation. Althira worked with the elders to understand the ancient rituals that had not been performed in generations, learning the words and gestures that would bind her to Karthus, not just emotionally, but spiritually and magically. Karthus handled the political and practical arrangements, ensuring that representatives from allied packs would be present, that the castle would be secure, that every detail would be perfect. But amid all the planning and preparation, they still found time for each other. Quiet moments in the early morning before the rest of the castle woke. Late nights in the library discussing pack law and how to improve it. Stolen kisses in empty corridors. They were building something beautiful, brick by brick, moment by moment. Althira also took time to visit the outer districts where she had once starved, bringing resources and implementing programs to ensure no one else would suffer as she had. The children she had once shared her meager food with now had full bellies and safe homes. The gratitude in their eyes, the knowledge that she was making a real difference, filled her with purpose. Karthus watched her work with pride and love. This was why the moon goddess had destined her for him. Not just because of her power, but because of her heart. She would make their pact stronger not through force but through compassion, and together they would create something lasting. The night before the ceremony, they sat together in Karthus's chambers, the moonlight streaming through the windows. Althira was nervous, he could tell, her fingers fidgeting with the fabric of her dress. "Talk to me," he said gently, pulling her against his side on the sofa. "What troubles you?" "I keep thinking about my family," she admitted quietly. "How they should be here for this. How my grandmother would have been so proud to see me become a Luna. How my father should be walking me through the ceremony. They were taken from me, Karthus, and even though we have brought justice, even though we have made things right, it does not bring them back." Karthus held her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "No, it does not, and I am sorry, more sorry than I can express, that you lost them, that the kingdom I inherited allowed such injustice to happen. But Althira, they are not truly gone. They live on in you, in your strength, in your compassion, in the way you refuse to let bitterness poison your heart despite everything you have endured. Tomorrow, when we complete the mating bond, they will be there in spirit. I believe that with everything I am." She turned to look up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "You really believe that?" "I do," he said with absolute conviction. "The moon goddess would not bring you through so much suffering only to deny you this moment of joy. Your family is watching, Althira, and they are proud beyond measure." She curled into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding, for not thinking less of me because I still grieve." "I would never think less of you for that," Karthus said fiercely. "Your capacity to feel, to grieve, to love despite the pain, that is part of what makes you extraordinary." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, simply being together. Finally, Karthus spoke again. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I wanted to give it to you tonight before the ceremony, so it is just between us." He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it. Inside lay a ring, delicate silver worked into the shape of intertwined vines, with a moonstone at its center that seemed to glow with inner light. "It belonged to my mother," Karthus explained. "She gave it to me before she died and told me to give it to my mate when I found her. I think she would have loved you, Althira. I think she would have understood why the moon goddess chose you for me." Althira stared at the ring, overwhelmed. "Karthus, I cannot. This is too precious." "You are too precious," he countered, taking the ring from the box and sliding it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "Please wear this tomorrow. Wear it always. Let it remind you that you are loved, valued, chosen." She looked down at the ring on her hand, then back up at him, and the love in her eyes nearly undid him. "I will treasure it always," she promised, "as I treasure you." They kissed then, slow and sweet, a promise of all the tomorrows they would have together. And when they finally parted to retire to their separate chambers for the night, as tradition demanded, they did so with light hearts and eager anticipation. The day of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect day that seemed ordained by divine forces. The castle was transformed, decorated with silver and white flowers, with banners bearing both Karthus's crest and the newly restored Sunwatch family emblem. Representatives from every allied pack filled the great hall and spilled out into the courtyards, all eager to witness this historic mating. Althira dressed in her chambers surrounded by attendants, though her thoughts were far away. Her gown was a masterpiece, white silk that seemed to shimmer with silver thread, flowing around her like moonlight-made fabric. Her white hair was braided with flowers and silver ribbons, cascading down her back. She wore Karthus's mother's ring on her finger and felt its weight like a blessing. When it was time, she made her way to the ancestral hall where the ceremony would take place. The same hall where she had awakened her power, where everything had changed. It seemed fitting that this should be where she and Karthus bound their lives together. The hall was packed with witnesses, but Althira saw only one person. Karthus stood at the center, dressed in formal robes that made him look every inch the powerful Alpha King he was. But when his eyes found hers across the distance, all that power and authority melted away, leaving only love and wonder. She walked toward him, her heart pounding but her steps steady. This was right. This was meant to be. Every step of her painful journey had led her here, to this moment, to this man. When she reached him, Karthus took her hands in his, and the bond between them sang with joy. The elder conducting the ceremony began speaking the ancient words, but Althira barely heard them. She was lost in Karthus's eyes, in the promise she saw there. They spoke their vows, pledging loyalty, love, and partnership. They shared blood, mixing it together in an ancient bowl to symbolize the joining of their lines. They called upon the moon goddess to bless their union, and the protective runes around the hall blazed so brightly that everyone gasped in awe. And then Karthus was pulling her close, kissing her as the assembly erupted in cheers. The bond between them, already strong, solidified into something unbreakable. They were mated, bonded, joined in every way that mattered. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing and crying at once. Karthus rested his forehead against hers. "My Luna," he said softly, the words a caress. "My mate. My love." "My Alpha," she replied, her voice full of wonder. "My mate. My home." The celebration that followed lasted long into the night. There was feasting and music and dancing. Allied packs offered gifts and pledges of continued friendship. The common wolves, who had been given access to the castle grounds for the day, celebrated with as much enthusiasm as the nobles, grateful for a Luna who understood their struggles and cared about their welfare. Through it all, Karthus and Althira moved together, never far from each other's side. They danced under the stars, her white dress swirling around them like mist. They greeted their guests with grace and warmth. They stood on the balcony and looked out over their kingdom, their people, their future. As the moon reached its zenith, Karthus led Althira away from the festivities to a quiet garden on the edge of the castle grounds. They needed a moment alone, just the two of them, away from the eyes and expectations of the crowd. They stood together beneath an ancient oak tree, the same kind of tree Karthus had been dying against when Althira had first found him. The symmetry was not lost on either of them. "Do you remember that night in the forest?" Karthus asked, his arms wrapped around her from behind as they looked up at the moon. "Every moment of it," Althira replied. "I remember thinking I should leave you, that I should let fate take its course. But I could not. Something in me knew even then that you were important, that saving you mattered. The bond even then, trying to draw us together." Karthus mused. "The moon goddess works in mysterious ways." "She does," Althira agreed. She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his bearded face in her hands. "But I am grateful for every mysterious twist, every impossible coincidence that brought me to you. Even the pain, even the suffering, because it led me here, to this moment, to you." Karthus covered her hands with his, turning his face to kiss her palm. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me, choosing this life." "You already have," Althira said softly. "You gave me everything I needed most, not just safety or comfort or power, but the chance to be seen, to be valued, to be loved for who I truly am. That is a gift beyond price." They kissed again, gentle and sweet, a kiss full of promise and hope. Above them, the moon shone down with benevolent light, and across the kingdom, wolves howled in celebration. A new era had begun, one where Luna and Alpha ruled together, where spiritual power was honored rather than feared, where compassion and strength walked hand in hand. Karthus and Althira stood together in their garden, Two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen each other despite every reason not to, who had built something beautiful from the ashes of pain and injustice. They were mated now, bonded, joined. And though challenges would certainly come, though the future was uncertain and the path ahead unclear, they would face it together. As one, as partners, as equals, as mates. The Alpha King and his Luna, ready to build a better kingdom, a better future, a better world. Together. And in that moment, under the watchful eyes of the moon goddess herself, everything was exactly as it should be. Broken pieces made whole. Scattered fragments brought together. Two halves of one soul, finally united at last. The night stretched before them, full of possibility and promise. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own joys and sorrows. But tonight, they simply stood together in the moonlight. Two people who had found in each other everything they had been searching for without even knowing they were searching. Love, purpose, home. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.